Now, aside from mob trials, I've also been to other federal trials. Back in 2005, I went to Governor George Ryan's federal corruption trial. Widespread corruption throughout the state of Illinois. They charged him with 18 counts. Some of the charges were mail fraud, extortion, money laundering, bribery. I remember seeing this guy at all the restaurants in Greektown, all the Italian restaurants on Taylor Street. Him and his team would go to all the Bulls games when Jordan was around, living it up. Now, the second defendant at this trial was George Ryan's good friend, Larry Warner, a multimillionaire Chicago businessman. They charged him with mail fraud, extortion, and money laundering. He had a very good defense, but they were no match for the United States government, and the judge gave him 4 years in jail and had to pay back hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, here's Prosecutor Burns, one of the best attorneys in the United States. These guys are cream of the crop. They have like a 99.9 conviction rate. He was one of the prosecutors that prosecuted Governor George Ryan and Larry Warner. In opening statements, he said that Governor George Ryan steered millions of dollars of state contracts to Larry Warner and his friends and family, and that corruption ran wild in the state of Illinois. Now here's U.S. Attorney Dan Webb, who represented George Ryan at his corruption trial. And Dan Webb hammered home that not one person ever seen George Ryan take a bribe or any sort of a kickback. He also said that you cannot believe anything Scott Fayewell says, that he was doing everything to keep himself out of jail. Although he put on a strong defense, it wasn't good enough. Now, they don't call Cook County for nothing. Back in the day, 70s, 1980s, throughout the 90s, and probably still going on today, they were giving away CDL licenses like candy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being exchanged through bribes. Some guys didn't even have to take the test. This was all under George Ryan's and his team, while he was Secretary of State and Governor of Illinois. Now here's Reverend Willis and his wife. And by this time at the trial, everybody knew the tragic Willis tragedy, and the judge would not allow it into evidence because it would just be too much for George Ryan's case. However, Mr. and Mrs. Willis sat front row every day in court, very quietly, so you felt their presence, and everybody felt so sorry for this family losing all their children. Now, back in 1994, Juan Guzman, truck driver that obtained his CDL trucking license illegally through George Ryan and the Secretary of State, was driving on 94 heading to Milwaukee. A piece of metal was hanging from his truck. Cars warned him to pull over. He ignored warnings. The piece of metal fell off. It ignited the gas tank of the car behind it and blew up the Willis family's children. Now, in all federal trials, there was one or two star witnesses. This was one of the government's main witnesses at the George Ryan trial. It was his chief of staff, Scott Fayewell, his right-hand man. He testified that he did not know that the governor handpicked an inspector that blocked the Juan Guzman investigation. Some of his testimony helped George Ryan. Some of it hurt it. At the end, he got 6 years. His girlfriend got 4 months. Now, part of Scott Fayewell's testimony was he explained to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury that George Ryan had a side business with his friends called McPeer, and it had a lot to do with all the multi-million-dollar contracts that went on at Navy Pier and McCormick Place. They had their own vendors in there, basically giving and receiving sweetheart contracts, making millions of dollars. Here's the widow of George Ryan, Laura Ryan. She was in court every day supporting her husband over 50 years. While he was locked up, she passed away. He asked the court if he could attend his wife's funeral. He was denied. And I don't understand why a nonviolent inmate is not allowed to visit their loved one's funeral services. I totally disagree with that. What do you guys think? Here's federal judge Rebecca Pallmeyer that presided over the George Ryan trial. Don't let her sweet looks fool you. She's one serious lady. She was born in Japan, went to Valparaiso University, and she insisted that George Ryan and Larry Warner would get a fair trial. She kept both attorney teams in check, but at the end, she agreed with the jury and found George Ryan guilty as charged. Guilty on all counts. Disgraced Governor George Ryan. Lost his $197,000 a year job and his pension. He got 6.5 years. His good friend, state lobbyist Larry Warner, got 4 years in jail. Had to pay a couple $100,000 in fine. And Scott Fayewell got 4 years. And his girlfriend got 4 months for perjury.